Welcome to the Republic of Nauru, or famously known as the country that made millions off of bird poop. This tiny island nation has a population of a little over 12,500 and a landmass of barely 8 square miles, only slightly larger than Los Angeles International Airport. But despite its tiny size, this South Pacific island served as one of the greatest lessons in economic crisis in history. So stay tuned, because in this video we'll be diving deep into the story of how this petite country managed to go from rags to riches and right back after losing 90% of its GDP. But before we move on, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon to never miss out on our videos. A little background. Nauru had always been broke to the point where no one even knew it existed. That was until the country figured out a way to become rich overnight. Unlike the Arab nations that climbed into riches thanks to oil, this tiny island had something called phosphate ore. Before anyone even discovered this tiny island, it had served as a rest stop for nearly 4 million years for the local seagulls in the area, which is the reason why it's more famously known as Bird Poop Island. Over time, their guano calcified, and the land became rich with phosphates, which today are used in fertilizers and other things by companies. Now, natural resources have been significant for the economic growth of many nations, but these resources aren't limitless, and poor management could lead to devastating results. And this tiny island gave us exactly that lesson. Many economists even go to the extent of referring to a lack of proper management of natural resource wealth as the natural resource curse, since it might lead to more negative outcomes than positive ones. The nation went from rags to wealth but fell into a worse state than before a few decades later, making it one of those rare instances in history where we have had such a clear opportunity to examine the economic factors that create these booms and busts. And all economists may learn from Nauru's lesson. So, how exactly did this tiny island become one of the wealthiest countries in the world? A British ship passed by the tiny island in 1798, which led to its discovery. The British called this island Pleasant Island because of the central plateau covered in greenery, surrounded by swinging palms and white sand beaches. A few decades later, the first settlers arrived on the island, and at first, they thought the only resources there were coconuts and pigs. But soon after, a British geologist discovered high-grade phosphate ore on the island. While the Middle Eastern countries were stacking up bills thanks to oil, this tiny island was preparing to stack bills for guano, bird poop. Scientists discovered algae and dried bird poop that had more potential use as raw materials for fertilizers, explosives, cosmetics, and animal feed. And lucky for this little pleasant island, about 80% of its area had this mineral. With the discovery of Nauru's phosphate resources in the early 1900s, several countries attempted to colonize the island. Control of Nauru passed from Germany to Australia to Japan before the country finally declared its independence in 1968. German colonists on Nauru were the first to mine the island, but when the First World War occupied them, Australia took advantage of the situation and annexed Nauru. The island's exports of this valuable substance reached 80 million metric tons in the years that followed, delivering the mineral to Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain, with their farmers paying far below market prices until 1963, turning the island into nothing more than an offshore mining site. But it's not like the island didn't benefit from this. After gaining independence in 1968, the Naurusians were no longer forced to mine phosphate. But that was all they knew all their lives, and phosphate exports were the backbone of their economy. In the 1970s and 1980s, Nauru relied heavily on phosphate mining for its revenue. In 1975, the country earned the equivalent of $2.5 billion, more than enough to satisfy its then population of 7,000 people. With its newfound wealth, people in Nauru bought cars and houses, the country built a hotel and a golf course, and it founded an airline so it could import Western food. The country was reaping the benefits, employment became a choice, and many chose not to work. After all, they could always depend on the government's free healthcare and education programs and landowners' royalties from phosphate profits. An increase in affluence and unhealthy eating habits due to increased imported food caused an epidemic of obesity in Nauru by 1980. The Naurusians' life expectancy is just a little over 60 years. Junk food consumption increased dramatically, and the country was ranked in the worst out of 170 by the World Health Organization in 2002. And as you can imagine, the workforce's poor health could have a significant impact on the economy. Due to their small size and geographical isolation, many industries couldn't flourish in the country. While the island did make a tidy sum from phosphorus mining, the colonial powers had already grabbed the vast majority of that wealth. So basically, the Nauruans were left with no other job but to mine phosphate, which would run out within a generation or two. This launched a period in Nauru's history where the tiny island was renowned as the wealthiest nation in the world per capita. In 1981, Nauru's GDP per capita was over $28,000, second only to Saudi Arabia. But unfortunately, phosphate shipments started to fall after that. Fall of agriculture. The agricultural industry essentially collapsed as a result of the extensive environmental harm that decades of phosphate mining caused. By 1968, one-third of Nauru had been strip-mined, and Nauruans were living on a narrow ring around a plateau of jagged, spiky, razor-sharp coral and limestone pillars. The island was already overworked for farming after the topsoil was removed for mining. While the phosphate mining industry was booming during colonial times, the Nauruan people saw very little of the profits. Most Nauruans could only afford inexpensive manufactured goods due to the economic collapse that followed the phosphate runout. This suggests that, after gaining independence, it was more out of economic necessity than greed that drove them to keep mining. And since mining was the thing that brought all the money, nobody cared too much about the agriculture sector, even though it's not a sustainable way of living to have to import all products, including food and water. The fall of Nauru's exports. Even after accounting for inflation, phosphate exports in the 1990s were approximately 25% of what they were in the 1970s. The total assets of Nauru were estimated to be almost $500,000 per person when it obtained independence from its trustees, like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and the UN in 1968. Unfortunately, spending during the boom years was mostly directed towards consumption and high public wages rather than investment, so it was not put to good use. Oftentimes, the investments that were made were not financially sound at all, and the people of Nauru were unemployed by choice. Government spending started outpacing revenue in the 1990s when phosphate income started to decline, leading to the country's near bankruptcy in the early years of the 21st century. Struggling to develop alternative sources of income before phosphate supplies ran out, Nauru turned to offshore banking, licensing around 400 foreign banks by the early 1990s. To open a bank, it was not even necessary to visit Nauru, let alone open a branch on the island. Even keeping bank records was optional. By the mid-1990s, Nauru was also offering economic citizenship, selling Nauruan passports with little scrutiny. However, in the late 1990s, Nauru fell into a lot of trouble. The tiny island was criticized for being an offshore tax haven and for selling passports, but it eventually stopped both of these things. By 2004, the government was deeply indebted and had trouble paying its debts, as the value of the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust plummeted from $1.3 billion in 1990 to $0.3 billion in 2004. So, against all odds, how did Nauru's economy bounce back to high income? Things were dismal back then, but Nauru has gone from rags to riches once again. Between 2013 and 2022, GDP grew at a constant price rate of 8% on average. In 2020, the World Bank even readmitted Nauru to the High-Income Country Club, after its income per capita surpassed the high-income benchmark of $12,535. To some, this may have been unexpected, but then again, Nauru is an unexpected nation. The government controls the majority of Nauru's economic activities. Nauru's tax-to-GDP ratio was 36.6% in 2021, above the Asia and Pacific average of 19.8%. It was also above the OECD average, 34.1%. And expenses have gone up along with income. In 2013-14, the government spent $128 million, and in 2019-20, it spent $242 million. But where did they get all this money? It all started in 2001, when Australia refused the MV Tampa to enter Australia, containing 400 mostly Afghan refugees, and instead found the so-called Pacific Solution to send them to Nauru. Australia paid Nauru to keep immigrants away from their shores, thanks to this regional processing center that has been the most important new source of income. An astounding 58% of Nauru's total government revenue in 2019-20 came from the RPC, according to the country's projections. While the RPC is now mostly unused, it's being kept up to date in case it's needed again in the future. The RPC contract is still quite profitable, with a monthly value of $29 million in 2019. Not to mention, in 2020, the Nauruan government collected almost $150 million in fees and taxes from it. In addition to being a significant moneymaker, the RPC is also a big employer. The Nauruan government employed 51% of the workforce in 2019-20, with an additional 15% coming from the RPC. Fishing in Nauru. Another factor contributing to the increase in revenue is the dramatic rise in the value of fishing in Nauru's waters. Licensing fees for fishing have increased from $25 million in 2013-14 to $73 million in 2019-20, after accounting for inflation. 8 Pacific states, together accounting for almost a quarter of the world's tuna supply, came together in 2010 under the Nauru Agreement to establish a unified licensing system for international fishing boats. Massive rises in licensing cost for the 8 signatories have now occurred due to this agreement during a period of high tuna prices. It appears that the nation has taken some of the bad management lessons from the past and applied them. Its debt has been mostly paid off. In addition, a new intergenerational trust fund was set up in 2016 to save money for the future. Nauru, Taiwan, and Australia are 3 additional nations that have contributed to the trust fund, and they co-manage it to prevent mismanagement. Nevertheless, Nauru remains extremely vulnerable. Today, the country confronts 2 primary economic risks. One, a collapse in tuna prices, and the other, a decision by Australia to discontinue supporting its little-used RPC. Nauru has spent most of its boom time money, but hey, at least they have a trust fund to protect themselves. The trust fund for Nauru has only managed to amass enough savings to cover around 1/3 of the annual budget. While waiting for fish prices to remain high and for Australia to continue footing the bill for its mostly unused regional processing center, Nauru should increase its savings rate. Unless that changes, Nauru's second period as a high-income nation might be just as fleeting as the first. So, do you think that Nauru's re-rise to riches is just another short stay like the previous one, or will the country continue to prosper? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel.